I think it'd be remiss of me not to say a few words on the significant anniversary we've just seen. It's 80 years since the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet troops. Other camps were liberated by the British, others by the Americans. But Auschwitz, of course, is the most documented and the most well remembered because it was the biggest, and a large part of the complex is still there. I've never been there. Um, I'm not sure if wanting to go would be the right term, but I think it's. I've been to some somber places in my lifetime. I've been to the Somme battlefield in northern France. That's pretty, it's got an atmosphere. I've been to the memorial site in Lockerbie. Been to a few battlefields, but I think Auschwitz is something that, everyone I've heard of that has been there, says what a searing impression it has. There will be one school of thought that says, at 80 years is a time to move on. Um, the problem with that way of thinking is, yes, it's a long time, but it is within living memory. And the sad reality is, there are people out there, and I've come across a few of them myself, who still deny this happened. I'm just going to quickly show you some of the press coverage because it's a big commemoration and it's probably the last big commemoration of the Holocaust, just as this year we'll probably see the last big VE commemoration and last VJ commemoration. This is the Daily Mirror and it's featuring the one British survivor who was at the commemorations at Smila Trivic. She's 94, she looks very good for her age, she looks a lot younger, I think. So that's from yesterday. This is today's papers. This old man is Stanislaw Salowski, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He actually wore his uniform that he had on at Auschwitz. It's today's Metro. I and the Daily Mail. They're leading on the King and Catherine. I'm not sure I would. I would lead on one of the survivors. Um, but the King was very moved by what he experienced. He was at the event in Auschwitz. Justin Trudeau was there. Keir Starmer was there. Although Starmer also read out a piece at the commemoration event presented by Rita Chakrabarty. I believe it was the Guildhall. I watched that with my parents. It was a very moving event, and we took up the suggestion that people light a candle in the house to remember those who died. Now, no one in my family, we're a Christian family, we never lost anyone in the Holocaust, but my paternal great grandfather was Jewish. He married I think she was a Methodist, so it didn't carry on that line. Um, and within this house that I live in, it's old house, Edwardian house, family that lived here, we know a bit about the history. They were a Ukrainian Jewish family who lived here from about the 1930s to the 1960s. No pictures of them, but we've a little bit of background information. It's hard not to believe that they would have been sitting in these rooms that I'm in now, here downstairs, maybe listening to the radio, maybe listening to reports about those camps being liberated. I mean, even the Allies were overwhelmed by the extent of it, I think, because there had long been knowledge that there was persecution going on. There had long been knowledge of the deportations of Jews, the displacement and the killings, going right back to the 30s. But I think the extent of horror that created those young soldiers, I mean, you're a 20-year-old American or British, or I mean, the Soviets had already seen the hell of war, but if you were fresh from, uh, not fresh actually, they would have come from the Normandy campaign, but you get my point, a young soldier seeing that. The scene in Band of Brothers, I never really watched that series, but there's a very powerful scene that shows them liberating one of the camps and just the sheer look of speechless, Schindler's List, of course, it needs no introduction, very famous portrayal of the Holocaust. There was actually a French documentary film made in 1985, which got a lot of acclaim. The only thing is I see with that, it was 9 hours long. Now, no one is going to sit through a 9-hour documentary. with a film like Schindler's List or The Pianist, and there's other Holocaust films, they reach a widespread audience in a way that a 9 hour documentary isn't going to do. You know, Schindler's List has its share of critics. I think it's one of the greatest films ever made. I think it's a very, very powerful portrayal of some of the darkest events in human history. You know, even 80 years on, the grimness of that place, even just seeing it in news archives and photos, is just horrendous. Um, of course, it wasn't the only extermination camp. Treblinka was pretty big as well. It was the second largest, I understand, after Auschwitz. Up to 1 million people killed at Treblinka. Belzec, Sobibor, Chelmno, they were the next biggest camps by in terms of numbers killed. Treblinka, it seems, there's hardly anything left. So, you know, Auschwitz is a visual reminder, and there's that sort of turret tower and the railway track, that's a famous image of Auschwitz. With Treblinka, it seems to be sort of overgrown woodland, it's less sort of visible, but it was also a, you know, hell on earth. You know, to think that this is still within living memory. I've come across people, I had a colleague, I won't go into further details, but I had a colleague and he just started spouting off about anti-Jewish conspiracy theories and how it didn't really happen. That disgusts me. I just cannot fathom that mindset. Um, there will be some, you know, who say we see equivalencies with the situation in the Near East today, and I've been quite vocal about that recently. But the equivocations go both ways. You get some very cynical Zionists who use it to their advantage, who exploit the Holocaust to somehow justify what Israeli forces are doing today. I think that's pretty contemptible, actually. But you also get um, pro-Palestinians who make equivalencies with the Nazis. I think that's also inappropriate. I don't think it's the same situation. I do think it's horrendous how many civilians have been killed, and there's some chilling things coming out, particularly from Donald Trump, talking about effectively advocating ethnic cleansing in Gaza. Because we always hear this mantra from the Holocaust, never again, never again. In the BBC documentary, there was a feature on some Bosnians living in Britain, and of course, they'd seen that happening again in the 90s in Europe, Srebrenica. We've seen the massacre of the Yazidi people, the genocide of the Yazidi people in northern Iraq. One was actually, there were several notable genocides that were not mentioned either in Starmer's speech or throughout that event. The persecution of the Uyghurs in China, I would say certainly that is in the lines of cultural genocide. Um, you know, ostensibly it's not to offend China, but what's going on there is absolutely horrendous. Families driven apart. There isn't necessarily mass killings in the same way, but I would say at the very least it's cultural genocide. The Rohingya people in Burma, um, and what is happening in Gaza would fit many definitions of genocide. I think it's still it's a horrendous situation. But anyway, the reason I mention that is not to be taboo or controversial. It's because I think that you get cynical people on both sides exploit the Holocaust to gain political points in today's conflicts, and I think that's wrong. Um, in terms of mass death, the Holocaust is unique. It's not to say, you know, it's often quoted Stalin and Mao killed more people than the Nazis, and that is true. And I'm a strong, strong believer that communist atrocities should also be remembered. The Holodomor in Ukraine, at least 3 million people starved to death. Um, I think the reason that Mao's crimes are not as acknowledged in the West, even in the West, is because the victims are overwhelmingly Chinese. They were Tibetans and Chinese Muslims, but they were overwhelmingly Chinese, so it's seen as an internal thing. But the killing fields of Mao's purges, particularly the Cultural Revolution, are absolutely horrendous. The killing fields of Cambodia, proportionately, Cambodia, Confucius at then was a small country. Rwanda. Um, there's been genocide since 1945. Um, indeed, it could even be argued the targeting of ethnic Germans after the war was a form of genocide. Thousands of German women raped. And that was largely just, even within Germany, that's kind of just, because I think the depth of depravity, of the evil of the death camps perpetrated by the Nazis was such that it was almost like, oh, well, the Germans better not complain about what happened to them afterwards. But that was also a crime against humanity. The thing is, with when we're talking about this stuff, people immediately get into, oh, you're comparing this to that. I basically take away the view that a lot of survivors of the Holocaust have said never again. As human society, we have to have consistent standards. You cannot say that one, killing some civilians is fine, killing another group of civilians is terrible. It's either wrong or it's not. There has to be consistent standards of human rights and with human standards. And as we know, there isn't. There's some very evil things happen in the world even today. Um, so it's hard to see that humanity's learned a lot from the Holocaust at all. The Shoah, to give the precise terminology for the Jewish people who were killed, as was pointed out though in the commemorations, there were also Romani, Slavs, Soviet prisoners of war, trade unionists, Catholics, the disabled. I mean, what a ghastly, ghastly, evil regime. Um, I think what the Shoah does serve, what the Holocaust more broadly does serve, to remind us is just how depraved the Nazi regime was, for sure, which certainly should fly in the face of revisionists who are now trying to claim that. I've seen this is why I'm so thoroughly disgusted by some right wing Americans who are so deranged in their worldview that they actually think that Churchill was the bad guy and the Allies were fighting the wrong person. They almost want to exonerate Hitler. I just want to throw up when I see that sort of argument. Um, and for Elon Musk to stick his nose into German politics and say they should move on and vote for the AfD, it's up to the Germans first of all what they decide. But to think this is a man that visited Auschwitz, and it makes you wonder. Most people, it leaves an impression. Elon Musk, you wonder. Um, but I will say this: anti-Semitic conspiracy theories must be robustly tackled. Anti-Semitism must be robustly tackled. Even looking at pictures of that place, you'd have to be made of stone not to feel something. To think that human beings were sent in their hundreds of thousands, in their millions collectively across the camps, and either worked to death, executed, contracting disease. It was just absolute hell on earth. I've read a book about the Gulag camp system in the Soviet Union. It was also pretty hellish, but it was somewhat different in the sense that it kind of rotated on itself. So guards themselves ended up being inmates. It isn't really comparable where there weren't really Nazis sent to the camps in the same way. There was a racial component Third Reich that was far exceeded anything I would argue in other totalitarian regimes. Because with China, it wasn't necessarily a racial component, it was more about enemies of the state. It was still hellish, and I think Mao's crimes should be absolutely made open. I hope one day that China admits the truth about Chairman Mao. Um, in the Soviet system, there were some racial aspects there. There was also persecution of Jews and minorities. But again, that was more about class enemies, and there was something uniquely sinister about the nature of the Nazi system, the whole racial purification thing, and that's just something very, very creepy about that. Um, anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I don't know if there's much more to add. These people are still with us, and their voices must be heard. It would be almost punitive to say, "Oh, never again," because we know that there's killings in the world today. Um, so what is the message of Auschwitz in 2025? I agree it shouldn't be forgotten. I wonder at some point when the last survivors pass away, will there be conversations about should we keep this up? I think there should be some sort of reminder there, whether it's in the same form or not, I don't know, but there should be something. This should never be allowed to be forgotten. And those academic fraudsters, the likes of David Irving and others, who deny that it happened, beneath contempt, absolutely beneath contempt. They always frame it as a free speech issue. It also has to be said in countries like Turkey, Holocaust denial is normalized. That's a disgrace. The other genocide I mentioned that was negated was the Armenian genocide and the Greek genocide and the Assyrian genocide, all committed by the Ottoman Empire. In fact, they were the most studied acts of mass killing until the Holocaust. Then we go out throughout history, of course, there was massacres committed by the Mongol conquests, the Islamic conquests, and of course European empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire. You know, the history of humanity has been oceans of blood. But I do think the Shoah, the final solution, and the Nazi death camps are almost unparalleled in how sinister they are, how uniquely, and again, I want to avoid getting the comparisons here, but that racial component and it's just so sinister. It should not be forgotten. And the voices of the survivors that are left have to be heard. Let me know your thoughts.